And our speaker for today is Stephen Harvey, who is the senior advisor to the Administrator, United States Energy Information Administration. And here's just a couple of fun facts about our presenter, and I would like to turn it over to Steve.
Well, thank you very much. And let me just start by saying congratulations to the Society of American Military Engineers on reaching 100. That's really quite a milestone. And thank you all for inviting me to spend a few minutes talking about energy use in the United States over that 100 years. First of all, EIA, Energy Information Administration, was formed in 1978. So we're a sprightly 42 comparatively. We are responsible for most of the official energy statistics for the United States. We also forecast energy activity into the future with a short-term 2-year forecast and a longer-term 30-year projection. Consistent with international best practices, we operate independently. That is, our work is not reviewed or edited by anyone else within the US government. And that's really intended to preserve the integrity of our statistics and our analysis. I am personally really excited to talk to you today for 2 reasons. One, I just generally love talking about energy trends, and I think that's fun, why it's a good place for me to be working, I think. And then second, I was a physics major in college, and actually having an audience where I can work directly from data and graphics is a real treat for me. So I'm going to be kind of rolling around in the data a fair amount, and hopefully that will be interesting to everybody. So let's go ahead and start looking at 100 years of energy use in the United States. And if you can click to the next slide. Here we go. Before I get to, let's go back one. Well, that's fine. We can just leave it right there. Before we get to the trends, I want to get 3 concepts down kind of firmly to help us as we start interpreting stuff. First of all, in energy statistics, when we use statistics, we tend to think in terms of balances. In effect, what energy is entering the system we're describing, how it's manipulated, and how it exits the system. So I'm going to start with looking at how energy exits the system we're looking at through consumption by end users. Second, the way I'm going to be generally talking about energy will specify whether it's primary or secondary. Primary energy, basically energy that's not been changed to another form. Think oil, crude oil, natural gas, coal, that sort of thing. Secondary energy is energy that's been transformed for delivery, like electricity or gasoline, something like that. Now, as a crowd with a lot of people who actually probably understand that the second law of thermodynamics means something, you can see where there are going to be issues every once in a while through this in thinking about an energy balance. I'll zip through them at a pretty high level, so it probably won't get stuck there, but keep this in mind. And so for simplicity, I'm going to certainly start and use primary energy whenever possible. And then third, in order to have statistics, you got to count something, and consequently, the statistics I'm using are going to come from the commerce around energy. In fact, we know there's a lot more energy working its way through our lives. For example, most solar energy used in the United States is primary energy. Temperatures rise during the day and stuff warms up. Only a tiny amount of that is turned into electricity, but that's what we can and do count, and so the balances, we'll think about it that way. So with those kind of contextual definitions, let's go ahead and look at the first graph. This is a graph of primary energy use in the United States from 1920 to 2018. Numbers are still coming in for 2019. We're living in 2020, so that was kind of close. This data series is constructed using a variety of sources. Of course, we're 42 years old, but we did have predecessors collecting some of the data, most significantly the Bureau of Mines. So, for example, our oldest data series is annual crude oil production, and that actually runs back before the Civil War. More data sets became available at different times, 1920 in a lot of cases, 1950s and the 70s. And so some of these graphs will have different periods of time associated with them, and we'll just go through that. Also quickly here, the units are known as quads, or quadrillion British thermal units. This is a very standard American measure of energy at the national level. If Personally, you prefer the metric system. You can multiply the y-axis by 1,055, and you'll have this in petajoules. But that's up to you. Much of our fuel-specific data then is also volumetric. We're going to use quads because using a constant energy content measure allows us to kind of think in terms of respective energy contributions. The first thing that's obvious from this graph is that between 1920 and today, we've increased energy use in the United States by 5 times. Five times more energy that we're actually using than we were 100 years ago. But let's break this down. So if we can go to the next slide. In the 44 years between 35 and 79, energy use in the United States increased at a really quite rapid rate, growth rate of about 3.2% a year. Of course, the early part of this period was dominated by growing energy use coming out of the Depression and into World War II. That kind of sagged after that, and then later growth accelerated with industrialization in the 60s and 70s. If you click, we'll go to the next trend. After a downturn in the late 70s and early 80s, really reflecting global oil shocks, and along with the sort of dysfunctional natural gas regulation, growth continued in the 25 years through 2007, though at a much slower level, about 1.3% annually. But in both cases, these are quite significant growth rates when you think about them in terms of increasing energy use. So if we click again, just want to highlight that really since about the economic downturn of 2008-2009, U.S. energy use has been pretty flat. Now, we know the economy has grown since then, roughly a couple of percent a year. And so it kind of raises an interesting relationship question between the economy and energy use. I looked it up, and U.S. gross domestic product grew about 18 times in the 90 years between 1929 and 2019 in real terms. So how did the U.S. economy grow on the order of 20 times in the last 100 years when the use of energy grew only by about 5 times? So let's explore this relationship more explicitly. Let's go to the next slide. By creating a ratio of energy use in BTUs to GDP in real dollars and looking at the history of that ratio, we can make the argument that, in effect, the use of energy to produce economic activity has become increasingly efficient really throughout much of that 100 years. Some older analyses indicate that this relationship was probably pretty flat prior to 1920 and fairly stable. But today, our economy uses only about a quarter or a fifth of the energy it needed 100 years ago to produce $1 of real GDP. This is pretty consistent, I think, with our economy moving from being driven more by industrial development and towards becoming a more services-based economy. So one of the questions is, where do we think this is heading? I mean, this has been true for a fairly long time. Last week, turns out we published our updated annual energy outlook. It projects U.S. energy data through 2050, and let's see what our analysts think about that. So if you click to the next slide, there we go. We see we have a reference case that we use. A reference case assumes some crazy things, but they're valuable things. It assumes that there's not going to be any new policy initiatives or regulations over the next 30 years. We do that because you can then use it as a benchmark to compare policy ideas or different technological assumptions and kind of see that. But our reference case suggests a couple things. First of all, if you look at total consumption, it remains pretty stable for about a decade, decade and a half, and then starts slowly growing again thereafter. If you look down at the lower line, the projected energy intensity we were looking at continues to drop, continues to reduce over time. So in effect, what's happening here is the energy use in the U.S. economy continues to get more and more efficient, but eventually the growth rates overcome that and start driving consumption back up again. But it's important as a point to remember that we do not see massive increases in energy use in the next few years. And this is a pretty robust conclusion, even against different assumptions about economic growth. There just isn't a whole lot of moving that energy consumption up. It's really pretty much flattened out. So keep that in mind, because we'll come back to that at some point in the future. So if we go to the next slide, we can, for me, this is fun. Since the 1970s, we've collected energy use by the United States government broken down into departments. And this is not a data set I get to play with very much. So it's a treat to have an audience that I think might actually be interested in this. No real surprise, the vast majority of energy used by the US government is used by the Department of Defense. I think the post office comes in a very, very distant second. Most of the energy used in the federal government is in the form of petroleum. Electricity is a very distant second, and natural gas is a little bit behind that, which I think is interesting. It suggests that that transportation is probably the activity that's using up most of the energy within the Defense Department and within the government as a whole. What we see from that 1975 fiscal year through a couple years ago trend is a very significant decline in the use of energy. If we can go to the click once, kind of looked at that trend, and since fiscal 1975, well, let's see, can we click on this real quick? Since 1975, the Department of Defense has decreased its use of energy by an average rate of about 1.5% a year. That's really, really quite significant. Also very interesting, the use of energy by the rest of the US government has basically remained the same during the entire period. So all of the reductions are basically attributable to the Department of Defense. Now, I will say, and I don't know enough to know if this is important or not, this is commercial levels of energy use. To the extent that there are, non-utility scale solar systems and stuff in the Department of Defense, they're not going to be counted here. But it seems unlikely that that's a very important thing. It looks clearly like quite a concerted effort to try to manage energy use, and a significant reduction over that period of time. So if we go to the next slide, we've kind of focused on energy use in aggregate, and what I'd like to do is drop down and look at how the energy mix has changed over the last 100 years. So let's go to the next slide. This breaks down that consumption into various constituent sources, and we can see a couple of things immediately about how energy is used in the United States, how it's changed from 1920 to now. In 1920, the US energy mix was completely dominated by coal. Petroleum and renewables, basically, the renewables were basically wood, were tied for a distant second. Of course, there was no nuclear energy, and natural gas was not terribly much in use at the time. As things developed by 1950, petroleum took over, remains the dominant form of source of energy consumed in the United States today, and we actually see that remaining true into the future. As you look at it after World War II, you see natural gas kind of took off as coal use was actually declining. Coal use surged, and in the 70s and 80s, nuclear energy kind of came on the scene. Coal use surged and natural gas fell. And natural gas fell for some regulatory reasons we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. And then over the last decade, natural gas and petroleum have surged consistent with supply and price changes due to the technological success of horizontal drilling and fracking, which have really quite significantly changed the dynamic there. During the last decade, natural gas has clearly been taking a lot of share from coal, along with a little bit of coal being pushed off by growing use of renewables in the most recent kind of years. So if you click once, what I'd like to do is kind of take us through this history and some of the concepts associated with it and show how energy use relates to some of the big things that were going on in the world. So during the Great Depression, we actually see reduced use of coal, more accelerated reduction in the use of coal. We see the growth in petroleum flattening out, and we see very little growth in other areas. I'll say, coming out of that period in 1938, just so that we're kind of keeping this in mind, the federal government decided to regulate natural gas prices, or natural gas in interstate commerce. So basically, rates for pipeline movements of natural gas in the Natural Gas Act. If we click once, we'll pull up World War II, where you can see a surge in the use of coal, petroleum, and in natural gas, all being used in the war effort, all expanding some of their infrastructure and building that out. Looks pretty clear in the picture here. I'll say a little bit after that, in 1954, in what was considered, I don't know, by many an odd sort of thing, the Supreme Court said, oh, you know, that regulation of pipelines back in 1938, well, that applies to wellhead prices of natural gas as well. So we're going to regulate the price of the natural gas in addition to the prices associated with moving it around in what was called the Phillips decision. And we're going to see the effects of that here in a few minutes. So if we click again, we see in the Arab oil embargoes in 1973 and in 1979, you can see the dramatic effect on the use of petroleum during those periods of time. Great source of I think, anxiety about our use of petroleum as an energy source, given those embargoes. And you actually saw some reactions, at least briefly, that then turned around a little bit after that. I'll say at this point, you see natural gas beginning to drop off. That had nothing to do with the Arab oil embargoes. That had to do with the wellhead price regulation beginning to discourage drilling in a big way. And by the time you get to that second one, which is 1979, right before that, 1978, given a lot of these concerns, a lot of the concerns about international interactions, the legislation was passed that formed the Department of Energy, that formed us. And also, as part of that package, the Natural Gas Policy Act began raising natural gas wellhead prices and began, in effect, a phased deregulation of natural gas production at about roughly that point of that second gray column. So if we click again, that process had worked itself out, and to the point where the wellhead regulations no longer kind of mattered very much in commerce in natural gas. And so Congress actually fully deregulated natural gas prices, wellhead prices in 1989. And you saw that was during a period of increased use of natural gas. And then if we click one more time on this slide, in 2009, the recession, the financial crisis of 2009, you begin to see a lot of movement in a lot of different directions for a lot of different reasons. The big one, of course, is natural gas trending up and coal use trending down. That's that share being shifted in a big way, and petroleum coming down and coming back up again. And we'll talk in a little bit more about some of the drivers associated with that. So if we go to the next slide, wanted to disaggregate a little bit look at renewables over the 100 years. Biomass was the dominant form of renewables from 1920 and into World War II, and that would mainly have been wood. That would have been again, this is fairly small compared to, say, coal at the time, but that would have been really what was going on. More recently, the surge in biomass is mainly the introduction and use of ethanol in the gasoline system. So it's very much a policy-based movement toward that. You see hydroelectricity developing over time as the big dams were put in place, but since the 1970s, very, very little additional capacity from hydroelectricity. Very variable, and that just has to do with precipitation levels in every year being very variable. And then, although small still, wind and solar have started taking off, wind a little bit earlier due to policy initiatives. We see in our forecasting wind slowing down as the policy initiatives kind of roll off in the future, but solar continuing significantly and becoming very, very important. And overall, we see renewables overtaking coal at least in electric generation within the next year or two, and actually even overtaking natural gas in the mid-2040s. Because they're so small now and they grow to such a big and important piece of everything else, we added a couple of cases to our AEO, to our annual Energy Outlook forecast last week that actually vary some wind and solar cost assumptions. And I should point out that our expectations about the future look pretty sensitive to those cost assumptions. So the components of renewables and their future could look very different depending on different assumptions of technology, different assumptions of policy going into the future. So we go to the next slide. I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about production, and I'm going to focus on petroleum. I'm going to focus on petroleum for a couple of reasons. One is it's where so many of our notions have been built up over time about where the United States sits in terms of energy production, use, and its influence on policy in the United States. And it's undergoing some very, very dramatic changes right now compared to what we would have experienced in the past. And it may be hardest to kind of see that and to understand what that means in terms of the way that people are relating to energy. So if we go to the next slide, this is a slide of production, imports, and exports of crude oil, not petroleum in general, but crude oil. We switched to a volumetric measure, billions of barrels, over the 100-year period. And you can see a couple things. You see that the consumption growth for petroleum really fueled production growth, which was really sustained until about 1970. Now, crude oil prices at that point were not regulated like the natural gas prices were regulated. And so the slowdown in production really was related to the fact that the technologies we were using at the time began running out of the resources available to those technologies, and production sort of naturally began to fall at that point. So if we click once, if you can click for me. So there we go. Really until the technological developments of combining horizontal drilling and fracking of source rock. This was an innovation developed and applied initially to natural gas development. When they started being applied to oil, we saw a very, very dramatic shift in the production of oil in the United States. And you can really see that change. So we went sailing back through kind of all the production we had lost since about 1970 and went through that fairly quickly. That little wobble you see there was very price related. Prices kind of dropped for a while there, and so production dropped. This is clearly a very economically driven kind of activity. If you'll click again, because of concerns about increasing imports that you see there, and because of that kind of shift in production, we in the United States had banned the export of oil, except to Canada, starting in 1975. That ban was lifted in 2015. And so you see actually exports beginning to move through that period of time as well. But what you see during that period of time, I think, playing out in terms of the import activities and the production activities is, and particularly during that period of 1993 till about 2013, we were importing more of the oil that we used than we were producing. And in many ways, this growth in petroleum use, this growth in production kind of ending because of the technological requirements, putting us in a position where we were just continuing to consume more and more, but we did not have the productive capability to do it, and we were being pushed more and more to using imports to kind of fill the gap there, created a lot of the, I think, senses of vulnerability as a country, given our exposure to international trade. And again, remember, the Department of Energy, EIA, were formed very much in that context, about where that first blue shift up as imports went shooting up happened, because of that kind of concern and that sense of exposure. So if you can click once for me, I'm going to shift the view from crude oil to the trade of petroleum. So I'm going to be adding things like diesel and gasoline, refined products, oil that's been run through refineries for us, to the overall picture. And what you see immediately when you put imports and exports here is that things have been changing very rapidly in terms of the relationship between imports and exports over the last really decade and a half. If you click again, with the ban on exports, and this gray box kind of is that same period of time, what we see is that actually exports of petroleum products, which were not controlled like crude oil was, took off long before crude oil trade was allowed. So if you click again, also most interestingly, when you're counting on a monthly basis, the United States began exporting more combined petroleum products than it imported as of last September, so just a few months ago. We expect this to continue and expand indefinitely in the next few years. We expect in 2020, the United States will export more petroleum products than it imports. And we actually see that being fairly durable really up until about 2050. What you can see though here also is that this is driven by growing exports, not really in recent years by dropping imports. The way to read this is that our position in global petroleum has shifted really from being an importer, pulling in raw materials that we need in order to meet our consumption needs, to becoming a refiner and trader of these petroleum sources. So it raises an interesting question. On the one hand, we had associated our sort of dependence on imports as being an important, certainly national security, certainly security in general kind of view of the world. I would say we no longer look like that, but in fact, our level of engagement in global petroleum trade is now significantly larger than it's ever been in the past. And so issues that come up in that international petroleum trade affect us very, very much, both in terms of business, in terms of we need energy, and also in terms of we need to do business as refiners. So a view that doesn't look really anything much at all like any of the period of time in the last 100 years. And again, the reason that I kind of wanted to focus on this for a few minutes is I think it puts, it raises a lot of questions about the assumptions we bring to the way energy works in the United States that can no longer really be viable going forward. And petroleum has really been at the center of this, as is some of these questions about renewables in the mix going forward, as is the surge in natural gas, as is the reduction in coal use, which certainly back in 1978 was seen as the way for the United States to increase its security and become more independent from an energy perspective. So to finish up, I want to talk, if we can click to the next slide, I'm going to finish up by looking real quickly at emissions, at CO2 emissions from energy. We track, in particular, carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So click one more time. What I've chosen to look at here are where interactions, emissions from energy in the United States come from. Overall, CO2 emissions from energy were rising all the way through 2006, at which point they began to fall. And as you can see here, you can kind of see illustrated here, it began to fall for a couple of reasons. First of all, that shifting share of electricity generation from gas to, or from coal to gas, so basically from older, less efficient coal plants to newer, more efficient natural gas plants, has resulted, because natural gas has a lower carbon content and because the efficiency of the plants are higher, the carbon dioxide being produced has dropped significantly from electricity. That is by far the largest and most sustained effect that we've seen. Secondarily, I think from several slides back, you saw that the increased use of renewables in the mix as well has also been sort of reducing the overall carbon generation from our use of energy. Haven't seen much change since the 70s in the nuclear contribution, and in fact, nuclear plants have, at a very slow rate, been decommissioning themselves. We don't see that. We see it remaining pretty consistent through the next 30 years, but it's sort of there. It's certainly become a policy question when people look at emissions. And then finally, sort of after the 2009 recession, we really saw a decrease, significant decrease in vehicle miles traveled in the transportation section, along with continued gasoline mileage improvements, policy-based mileage improvements. And between those two things, they had reduced CO2 contributions for transportation for several years. Although, as you can see here, that trend has reversed, and we actually see that reverse in trend going forward into the future. We see that electric generation production will continue to decrease for some time until economic growth-driven increases in energy use for transportation and industry overcome that trend. And as a result, overall carbon dioxide production will continue to drop for about the next decade and a half, and then begin to rise again. And at least right now, we see production of carbon in 2050 in that reference case as about 4% from energy, as about 4% lower than today, although trending upwards at the time. Of course, on the one hand, that's nice. It's less than it has been. On the other hand, that doesn't even come close to really meeting some of the policy goals that are being discussed at different times. And so our expectation is that we will, over the next decade or two, we'll be seeing some attention and possible policy changes associated with that. So if you go ahead and click to my last slide, thank you very much for letting me take you on a whirlwind tour of U.S. energy over the last 100 years. I hope I've encouraged you to develop some questions, and I would be happy to do that. But with that, let me hand the presentation back.
Thank you again, Steve, for the
Tamel, this is Dave Howe. Tamel, while people are formulating their questions, I'd like to express a couple of thanks. One to Norm Campbell, who arranged this webinar. Thank you, Norm, and of course to Stephen Harvey. Excellent presentation. I think this really captures the kind of industry government engagement that the society is focused on, and you've given us a pretty good strategic view of energy trends as SAME goes into our next 100 years. So thank you very much. And I would invite everyone to hit Stephen with your hardest questions. I think he can handle them. And Tomel, thanks for your help.
No problem at all. Dave, if you want to go ahead and just, as the questions come in, you can ask Stephen the questions.
Certainly, and also Norm, you may have discussed some questions with Stephen in advance. I'm not sure what you did there.
I think I forgot to send any, but so it's kind of my fault on that.
Stephen, at the risk of asking an obvious question, and I'll do this orally rather than in the chat room, since we're talking already. The energy consumption for transportation, and in particular, the Department of Defense. Like I say, I should know the answer to this question. I don't think the defense transportation energy consumption captures or at all addresses the energy consumption on the parts of those of us getting to work for the Department of Defense when we did that. Is that correct?
I'm almost certain that is correct. It would be just actually what was used probably in equipment and vehicles and in bases. But it wouldn't be, it would not be people driving to work. That would come in, that would show up differently for us. Right.
And of course, I'm asking that question on the basis of fluctuating interest in telework in the Department of Defense and other federal branches of the government. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, I'm going to go back on mute. And Norm, do you want to take care of the questions that are coming in on the chat function? In fact, I see you've already got one up there. I'll go back on mute.
Sure. Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Stephen. I appreciate it. I think the first question really was, with the extent of renewables hitting the grids, what do you see on the storage side of things? I mean, lithium ion has got some benefits, but it's also has some detractions. So, what other storage or avenues are being looked at, or that you've seen that are trending?
So we definitely, like in our forecasting, we have to make biomass was the dominant how things like batteries get deployed, and certainly in renewables, we call them intermittent resources. You don't necessarily have them producing electricity at the time you need to consume the electricity, and that creates, certainly in certain pockets, that's created pretty significant dispatch issues for electric generation. I mean, one way to think about that is, I know in California during the fall and the spring, they have pretty serious issues because they've got a lot of solar energy coming in the middle of the day, which used to be the time when you had to generate the most electricity other ways. And you actually have to turn a lot of things off, and then you have to turn them back on again as you go into the evening, given the size of and distribution of that. So storage works can work in a couple of different ways. There were attempts for a long time to do, and there are a certain amount of pumped storage where during like the evenings, during times when there's extra electricity on the system, water gets pumped uphill and then comes down back through basically generators during the day or during the times when there's more of a peak energy effort there, need. And but those are kind of hard to use because they take a lot of land, they take a lot of space, there are environmental issues, so they haven't really penetrated terribly far. They are used in a couple of different cases. As a result, I think a lot of the focus really is on developing batteries and battery technology. And we do assume a certain amount that will permit continued development of those intermittent resources going into the future. But I would say it is another one of those cases where there's a great deal of uncertainty because there's so much technological development in terms of figuring out how to deploy those effectively that creates a lot of uncertainty. But we haven't come up, we have not come up with any alternative that works really, really great. It is my belief that if someone could come up with a really cheap, dependable battery that you could you could see another radical technological transformation in the United States. Things would look completely different.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. Another question here. Let's see, electrical vehicles are coming on the scene that energy has to be generated somehow and transmitted over to power lines with losses and associated issues. Most folks think that electricity is a clean energy, but is it really cleaner overall than burning gasoline and transferring it straight from an internal combustion engine to a powertrain? So I guess that's a, I'm going to call it the holistic look at consumption and emission trends based on electric vehicles from generation at not just versus point source emission generations. If I try to make sense of that.
See, I told you guys how exciting it was going to be to actually talk to people that understand the second law of thermodynamics. So there's always going to be losses one place or another, and electricity is that kind of secondary energy where a lot of those losses, to the extent it's coming from combusted fuels, took place somewhere else. Electricity is basically there are less losses sort of associated with using electricity to drive motors than there are, say, gasoline, because you're going through a process it's already been gone through on electricity. That's where I think it's really interesting to look at, like, the CO2 picture of transportation. There is embedded in that transportation set of numbers electric vehicles, or is there actually? As I think about it, when I developed that, I think I might have kept the electric stuff out so you kind of see what the different pieces are. Electricity as a whole is generated from a whole lot of different things. Today, it's generated from a whole lot more natural gas and renewables and hydro and nuclear and dwindling amounts of coal and almost no petroleum anymore. As a result, overall, electricity is becoming, on sort of average, less of an emitter, as you saw in that trend line of CO2, even as more electricity is being generated. In the end, I think that's why the push for electric vehicles is the hope that you could look at non-emitting sources of electricity for growth in those vehicles through things like using even nuclear, using renewables, that sort of thing, as opposed to gasoline in a car. But it's not because one is inherent. They're different. One's kind of more refined in a sense than the other one in terms of where any losses took place in the first place. So there's an argument to do it because you can have utilities that can become cleaner overall. It's harder to do that on every automobile engine kind of basis. But and again, in the end, we don't see going forward electric vehicles penetrating enough to really make that whole transportation area that much more efficient that way.
Oh, interesting. I've got a follow-up question on that last statement, but I'll go with the other folks here first. Will any reduction in CO2 from electric vehicles be offset by an increase in industrial emissions due to battery production?
So thinking about these issues, particularly when you're thinking about policy, thinking about these issues from a life cycle perspective is a really, really good idea. I do not off the top of my head know the answer to that, but I think it's a really legitimate question to say how those relationships wind up working. My guess is the technology on the battery side, at least at its current levels, is probably pretty contributes probably a fair amount of CO2. Whether that would be true 10 years from now or 30 years from now, as we're looking at our forecasting, I don't know. I don't know what our assumptions are along those lines.
Okay.
But it's a great question.
Another question was, what do you see looking at fuel cells in the hydrogen economy?
Yeah, so hydrogen, the way to think about hydrogen is as a secondary energy form. It isn't. It isn't like well, it is a source. Obviously, in the sun, middle of the sun, it's a big source of energy for us. But it really is more like a refined product. It's more like a gasoline. So it's a matter, if you're taking like seawater and you're pulling hydrogen out of it, you're going to put energy in to do that. So you will have, again, these life cycle losses or consumption of energy in order to get energy into that form. Once it's in the form of hydrogen, it's much more efficient and much more usable, like analogous to electricity, to some of the sources for electricity, analogous to gasoline for some of the sources for gasoline.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Storing hydrogen is also an issue based on its molecular characteristics, but
right. Any new technology has all sorts of interesting dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do you foresee a difference in the future of the carbon emissions trends depending on the upcoming election?
So again, we in our forecasts, we have a kind of central benchmark reference case that basically is designed to have no opinion whatsoever on any future policy direction. And we do that because sometimes, it isn't part of our release most recently, but sometimes we are in fact asked by the government or components of the government to run cases that examine different policy options. I will say it's pretty clear from our interactions with the folks in Congress, and I'd say on both sides of the aisle, that we are likely to get pressure to do a lot of forecasting over the next couple of years around carbon emissions. And in fact, it's led us to spend more time and effort trying to understand. It was not an area of our model that we built the model to be really great at doing. And so we're spending a lot of time trying to improve that under the assumption that we're going to get asked by Democrats and by Republicans to look at various policy options here pretty soon. It's one of the reasons we added those cases I was talking about earlier about kind of renewable cost assumptions. In the past, we just kind of plugged one in and we didn't worry about it, and it just learned what you learned in the reference case. And this year is the first year where we're saying, yeah, if solar and wind costs are low, it looks like this. If solar and wind costs are high, it looks like this. But we expect there to be a lot of pressure on us to help think through the issue. We don't go out in advance and do any forecasting around that because we're not in the business of telling people what their policy options should be.
Right. Okay. That's going to be an interesting thing to model. Sounds like a lot of variables.
Yeah.
Another question: how have some states restrictions on new natural gas pipeline construction, specifically thinking of the Northeast, impacted forecasts?
So yeah, we've definitely seen, not so much in some of our short-term forecasting, we have seen this. Because natural gas production growth has been so fast, along with oil growth, you've actually seen pipeline constraints matter a great deal around natural gas actually both in the Northeast and in Texas, in the Permian in Texas, where natural gas growth was just so fast it overwhelmed the system like really, really fast. And in fact, the issue does pop up a lot out west where flaring becomes an issue. If you're producing, for example, oil out of an oil well and you're getting natural gas too, and you can't put the natural gas anywhere within certain constraints, in certain places you can just burn it, and they would call it flaring. And that happens, given the choice, you'd sell it somewhere, but if you don't have the choice to sell it, you don't sell it. We've also seen, based on that, in places, again, this tends to be more out west, where you've got bigger spaces to move stuff. We've seen prices become negative, which is something that everybody kind of always had a hard time getting their heads around during the development of sort of commercial operations around natural gas. But you actually see producers in certain cases paying people to take away the natural gas. And this, again, tends to come from wanting to develop oil as opposed to natural gas. In the Northeast, you don't have a lot of that combined oil and natural gas. And so you don't have that driver. But as a result, what's probably happening is that in certain places that don't have enough pipeline capacity to get it out of sort of those Appalachian basins, people are just not developing their wells very much. They'll like drill a well, let it sit, and then add it when capacity gets added. So the effect's a little harder to see than the sort of dramatic effects of negative prices and new pipelines massively expanding movements like you see out west.
Okay, thanks. That's interesting. Just from an aside, talking about the hydrogen back in there, I've noted that there are some companies that are utilizing the excess renewables when they're not able to be dispatched to produce hydrogen on margin because they would have had to either put it in a load bank or lock the wind turbines up.
Sure.
Are those kind of alternatives being looked at in your models?
I don't think those have penetrated all that far. To me, those are clever ways of creating things that are pretty much the same as batteries, in that you're moving energy into a form. So it's like the pump storage I was talking about, where you pump water uphill when you've got too much electricity on the system, and you let it flow down when you have less. There are a few cases where people have actually even used like flywheels, where you would use flywheels in order to store and then pull electricity back off the system later. Those technologies haven't penetrated very far, but again, as you add more intermittent renewables to the system, the demand for that's going to increase, and I would think you'll see more and more of that emerge. So our models of that are pretty simplistic and don't go into that much detail, but it's clearly a function. That battery function is really important.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see. I think that was the last question that we had in here, unless anybody else has one that they'd like to pose. Very intriguing. It was definitely was a good kickoff to our run to 2020. But wait, here we go. Matt, thanks, Matt. All right. Though nuclear has a damaged reputation from safety, it is a zero CO2 source. Do you see any reversing of the downward trend for nuke long-term trends of decommissioning of plants?
So we don't, in our forecasts, even the long-term forecast, you can click for any additional nuclear plants coming online. I will say, being in Washington and seeing some of the policy issues that are being considered, that the idea of trying to use technologies to build additional nuclear supplies or nuclear plants with the environment in mind, in part, is actually something a lot of people are talking about. We just haven't seen, our experts on electricity haven't seen enough movement in that or enough promise in that to actually incorporate it into our models yet. But that would be an area that I would expect that there'll continue to be some focus on.
Okay, but that's kind of there's a follow-on question about small-scale nuclear reactors. It sounded from a meeting I attended last week in DC, Operational Energy, it sounded like the Army was actually very interested in small portable nuke reactors in the 5 to 15 megawatt range. Are you guys adding that into your reviews, or is that part of the pipeline for analysis?
Yeah, again, our guys haven't been convinced that will happen. That is definitely those are definitely the kind of technological innovations, smaller, more compact, more deployable kind of things that are absolutely being considered right now. But right now, our guys aren't quite buying that they're going to be incorporated over the next 30 years. That could change very, very quickly depending on where the technology goes. And let me just say, we didn't, when we were forecasting 30 years in advance, a decade or a decade and a half ago, we weren't showing those shifts in production of oil and natural gas either. So we tend to look at kind of straight lining stuff out into the future. So I'm not sure we'll ever be the best. What's the next, cool technology? I will say the experience of the United States over the last 100 years in energy is there almost always is a next cool technology.
Excellent. Here's a question on highway traffic management for electricity. How much impact will the organized energy markets, so say CalISO or MISO or PJM, have on demand and resource mix?
In terms of transportation, or in terms of the?
I think really what is asking is if the RTOs, and Chris, if I'm not getting this right, go ahead and amplify. But it sounds like what roles are you predicting that the ISOs and the RTOs are playing on the resource mix?
Okay. Because of the way the RTOs are, so let's take PJM for example, here in the sort of mid-Atlantic, upper Northeast. It's an area where coal was dominant for a very, very long time. Because those markets have a very market-based mechanism where things have to kind of compete at the margin. What you can see very clearly in PJM dispatch is that as natural gas prices came down in the Northeast, they displaced coal very, very quickly, probably more quickly than would have taken place in a more utility sort of average cost-based dispatch, because it was a much more reactive system that way. California is a little different, although you could make some similar arguments about the way renewables have been integrated in California. Certainly the California ISO has a lot of experience with integrating renewables into its system. But in like the California case, there's of course a lot of state policy that gets integrated into that. That would be true of New York ISO, to a certain degree, New England, and things like that. But I would say probably the mix, the speed where you see that mix shifting, and you saw in those graphs that mix between coal and natural gas in particular shifting, and then the renewables building in, some of that has been made faster and more responsive because of those mechanisms.
Okay, great, thanks. So we're getting to the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so we're going to close it out here. Certainly appreciate everybody's attendance and attention. It was really good. And again, Stephen, thank you very much for a very educational presentation. Learned quite a bit. Glad we did this. Right. Upcoming events. Yes, we have DoD briefings and JETSI. Definitely make sure you got JETSI on your calendar. It's going to be a massive blast this year. And DoD briefings March 16th through 18th. And Tamel, I think just a pitch for national, the calendar, you can find it all on that calendar and national on the website. That is a great place to go looking for information. So I think that is the last of it. That was the last slide, Tamel? I guess, yes.
Yes, it was.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for managing call and presentation for us, Tamel. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you guys for just putting all of this together on your end. It's been a great webinar, very informational one as well.
Okay, and I have a tease for next briefing. If anybody's still on the line, it's going to be some energy folks from AFRL, and some of those questions that you guys were, Air Force Research Lab, sorry. Some of those questions that you were asking about the next generation, they may be able to tell more about that. Stay tuned.